Commissioner Shannon.
I think she's with President Biden right now.
Commissioner Sirota.
Present.
1, 2, 3, 4. 7 members present. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Could we have an approval of the minutes, please?
I'll move approval. This is history.
I second. It's Michael.
I have to abstain because I was absent last month.
Okay, so let's go ahead and do the roll call for the minutes. Commissioner Mandel?
Approve.
Commissioner Grimmick?
Approve.
Commissioner Osi is absent. Commissioner Avila?
Approve.
Commissioner Estradas is absent. Commissioner Gavidia?
Approve.
Commissioner Historic?
Approve.
Commissioner Cato is abstaining. Commissioner Kalfani is absent. Commissioner Lemos is absent. Commissioner Pack is absent. Commissioner Shannon is absent. Commissioner Sirota?
Approved.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. Looking for the neighborhood council. Anybody from the neighborhood council here or in the call area? I see none. Seeing none, we'll move on to public comment.
And before we take public comment, we need to read the following statement. Members of the public who would like to offer public comment on the items listed on the agenda should call 1-669-254-5252 and use meeting ID 161-909-7326 and then press pound. Press pound again when prompted for a participant ID. Once admitted into the meeting, press *9 to request to speak. Thank you.
Is there anybody in the waiting room for the public comment?
There is one person in the waiting room right now.
Could you invite them in and announce them, please?
The host would like you to unmute your microphone. You can press *6 to unmute.
Caller with phone number ending in 385, please press *6 to unmute yourself and state your name and the agenda item you are speaking on.
The host would like you to unmute your microphone.
Could you announce that again to them,
You can
please?
press *6
Yes.
to unmute.
Speaker, you are on the line with the Los Angeles City Health Commission. Caller with phone number ending in 385. Please press *6 to unmute yourself and state your name and the agenda item you are speaking on, please.
The host would like you to unmute your microphone.
Just an FYI,
You can press
I'm not
*6
at my
to
computer.
unmute.
That's our technical issue over here. I know I did receive an email from one of our IT folks in the city about calling, that he was going to be calling in. That may be his number. I don't know. I don't have access to my email. So let's just leave it there. Not remove the number and leave it for the duration of the meeting.
Can you unmute that individual yourself, Rita?
They are currently unmuted.
Oh. It looks like to me that they have a mute signal on them.
The host would like you to unmute your microphone. You can press *6 to unmute.
And then for the record, it looks like Commissioner Lemus just joined us.
So currently talking is permitted. They can unmute themselves. They have just chosen not to at the moment.
Fine, then we'll move on to the agenda. We have a full agenda tonight. Thank you, members of the public who have the ability to call in anytime or attend the meetings when hopefully we'll be back in live. Moving on, we're
Commission President, so public comment is now closed?
Yes, public comment is closed.
Thank you.
You are muted.
if I can ask a legal question, Mr. Vaughn, is the way my agenda is set, do we have Dr. Elibetti being the first speaker on the agenda?
I believe Dr. Elibetti is the first speaker on the other agenda, the special meeting. So
can we legally go to that first?
Not until 6:15.
Correct.
Just being that he's in St. Louis, and I'd hate to have him. And though Ali, you're welcome to stay on the whole meeting, and the other speakers are going to be amazing, and their presentations are fantastic. But I also realize that you don't necessarily want to stay up all night. So we have to wait to 6:15, which is 6 minutes.
Do you want to take item 3 on the regular agenda?
Yeah.
Or item 4, whichever one you think is not going to take very long.
Yeah, let's do item 4 first, because I can't imagine. I know that Commissioner Sirota wanted to make some comments with some ideas, and that might work beautifully. Thank you for the suggestion.
Yes, hi. I had a couple ideas for future things we could talk about, and one of them was talking about if the city of Los Angeles should have their own health department. Right now we're under the county of Los Angeles, and Long Beach and Pasadena has their own health department. And I think in the future we should have some discussions if Los Angeles should have their own health department. Secondly, I would like to discuss some of the council people right now are talking about possibly leaving LASA, which is the combination of the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles, helping the homeless. And I think we should have that discussion as well in the future. And thirdly, I was talking to the clerk's office today, and the possibility that we could give out certificates of merit to different health agencies within the city of Los Angeles coming from our health department or our health commission. And I was talking to the clerk's office, and they said they'd look into it, and they think it would be a good idea, and it won't cost very much. So that's down the road. And I guess we could talk about it in future meetings. Thank you.
I think those are 3 great ideas. I would say that if we were going to discuss how other cities run their health department, that we recognize that 40% of the budget of the County of Los Angeles Department of Public Health is actually directly related to the city, and that Long Beach and Pasadena have carved out, have their own systems. Perhaps we would have either their head or chief medical officer from Pasadena DPH and Long Beach DPH be individuals to talk at that meeting. It's such a weighty topic that I think that would be something that would probably be the only agenda item, and we also should probably invite the controller of the city of Los Angeles and perhaps the treasurer to weigh in, and then additionally somebody from LA County DPH, which I assume would be against that proposal. And I think if you had those 5 presentations, that would be, allow us to have a good conversation, discussion. Council Vaughn.
Just to add to that since 2012, I believe it's been put on an agenda either in council or commission or committees of council. It's been discussed twice, heavily discussed, and I'm not sure if there's a CLA report on it or not. Twice it's been discussed about having the city have its own health department. So since 2012, that's actually been a topic twice that has been brought up through City Council. So there might be some research materials for the research associates to look at with regards to that topic, because I believe it's gone down the road a few, all the way to the CLA, maybe even the CAO reports on it, and the costs and such like that. So I know there's information out there since 2012. So for the research associates to look.
Yeah, and I believe it was in July of this year that we sent out an analysis economically that was sent to all the commissioners and minimally discussed here at this commission with the admittedly stale, but the last economic analysis of the proposal. There hopefully might be a more modern analysis. If not, we should resurrect that one and find out who analyzed it and created it so that they could present it to us so the commissioners can ask questions. And also just noticed that Dr. Kalfani just, I think, joined us about 5 minutes ago for the minutes. Anybody else have any other ideas that they'd like to discuss? We have several others. There's a Dr. Gandhi from UCSF who I believe is in line to speak in October, and there was one other individual that I'm blanking on that we already have in the queue to present. But we'll entertain from any other commissioner, any other ideas you have. Feel free to notify myself or one of the research associates, and they'll assist you in doing that. Seeing the time, we can now go out of order and go to the special agenda. It's a great pleasure to introduce a associate professor from Washington University in St. Louis, who's one of the leading experts on antibodies and the length of time that the spike protein exists and maintains itself. Dr. Ali Elabedi, and please let me know if I'm destroying your name. I apologize. Associate Professor of Pathology, Immunology. Doctor, we're thrilled that you could join us today, and we're looking forward to your fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much. You pronounced it perfectly, so thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, this is something relatively new to me. So I appreciate the opportunity. And yes, it's getting into the later side here, but it's I think we are still in the good side, so we are not that late yet. So thanks for the consideration. So I will discuss today. Actually, I was wondering about. I wanted not to have a very long presentation, but I wanted to tell you about what's going on in the lab, what we learned so far in the last very busy 20 months so far from this pandemic. But also I wanted to first start with touching base about what we actually know about vaccines and how our successful vaccines in the past that we developed over the last 100 years, more than 100 years, actually works. So let me start by, yes. So first, these are my disclosure. These are not really related to the work that I'm going to present to you. So first, as I discussed, I'm going to talk generally about the impact of vaccination, and this is not really something I don't think it will be new to any of you. I don't think I need to convince the audience about the importance and the impact and huge impact of vaccination on our health in the last century. And then I will discuss about our results for studying B-cell responses in patients that have experienced mild infection for SARS-CoV-2 infection. And this is a study that started in March and April in 2020. So this was relatively early in the pandemic. Missouri, we were a little bit behind. We were behind Washington State and New York. March was probably starting to see the increase, but April is really when we started getting the numbers there. And then the last part, this is an ongoing project that we have been working on for the last, since December, basically, since the first rollout of the vaccine, especially the Pfizer vaccine. And I'm going to share with you the data we have so far. This is an ongoing project. There's literally data that we are generating every single day. So it's hard to give you this is the latest we have. There are definitely new data by the end of the week. So I'm going to give you a hint about these data, but I'm not going to show it because it's just not really, it's not ready yet for presentation. So obviously feel free to stop me at any time. There's really not any reason, but I can also take questions at the end if you wish. And the next slide I'm going to show, I always like to warn my people looking at the presentation. Can be considered a bit graphic, but I really like it because it gives the message very clear. So you have been warned. So this is actually MS taking in 1901, so 120 years ago, in Leicester, UK, for two 13-year-old young men, I would say, or boys actually, and they have been exposed to the same smallpox infected person, obviously, at the same time, but only one of them was actually vaccinated at birth. And obviously you can tell which one is the one who was vaccinated. So this is how powerful vaccination can be in preventing these even 13 years later. And this is very important. So another example of how vaccination really helped us in the last 100 years is the polio, which I'm assuming none of us on the call here experienced the nightmares of the 1930s and 40s, and this is when the summer nightmare of polio virus. And although that not every kid gets infected actually gets the full paralysis, but it was a nightmare. And this is wild polio in 1988, and this is 20 years later. This is when you have a massive vaccination campaign globally. This is what happens. Except for a very, very few pockets. This is actually not updated. Right now, we know India is free, and we know that there's just a small pockets in Pakistan and some in West Africa, but really it's almost, we know that the loss, and actually Africa has been transferred, so it's actually that small pocket that still we have wild polio, but we are very close. So in summary, we had really a very successful enterprise now with vaccination in the last century. You know, elimination and complete elimination, eradication of smallpox. Smallpox was a really deadly disease. We are talking about wiping out complete places or complete countries when this virus was introduced to them. Polio is completely, basically no one here would be literally talking about polio, and measles and mumps and rubella, except for measles we only hear about when we have lax in vaccination and we get outbreaks, but still largely controlled. Influenza is a challenge that has been ongoing, but again, it's still relatively under control, although we all know that the vaccine can get better, and I'm very optimistic that it will get better. We have largely controlled other viruses like hepatitis B, papilloma with vaccination, rabies, which, as you know, is 100% fatal once symptoms show. We know that now we can treat it with vaccine or with. We can also do the antibody therapy or the polyclonal antibody therapy. So there's definitely a lot of diseases that used to be absolutely fatal that we now control. And one note that I would like to remind everyone here is that when we talked about these diseases, we never, when we said we controlled them, we never looked at are there any breakthroughs infection or not. We looked at are there any death or severe disease or not. That's how we controlled those. We don't really look. We didn't look at by PCR over the last 100 years on every single breakthrough infection to assess the vaccine. We assess the vaccine based on this: do you have severe disease or you don't? Do you have decrease in mortality or you not? And this is the important point, that vaccines are not meant to completely prevent the infection. This is an impossible target that it's not going to happen. Vaccines are meant to really prevent death and severe disease, and for that it's very obvious that they are doing the job, even with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic we are going through. So all of these examples, the examples of vaccines I mentioned, many others. This is 10 years old slide, but still many of the vaccines that have been approved by the WHO here depend on mainly one thing that we discussed before the call about serum IgG. So immunoglobulins are really the antibodies that come in different flavors. They can be found in blood, what we call serum IgG here, or we can find them in the mucosal, can be IgG, but mainly IgA. But what we found over the years that the main correlate that we can actually find consistently with those successful vaccines, many of them are bacterial as well as viral vaccines, is that serum IgG. Once you have IgG, this usually is a correlate of protection. You have a reason for us to think that this is a protective vaccine. Because it's easy to sample, because it's in the blood, it has been adopted as this is the way to assess the success of immunization, the success of potential protection. So how is that serum IgG is produced? So when you get immunized or infected, for that matter, so our body recognizes that this is a foreign entity, and a small group of our B cells, which is part of our lymphocytes, white blood cells, respond to that infection and differentiate to a different kind of cell. It's almost transformed to these antibody-secreting, antibody-producing cells. And those are the antibodies that we see in our blood. Those cells are short-lived. So, and this is something will become very important in the next few slides. Remember that our immune response really is very measured in a way. It doesn't, it cannot be that once it's activated, it doesn't have any breaks. The break is if you don't have any more of the foreign entity, which is in vaccine or in the virus in case of infection. Those cells are short-lived. They are not allowed to be producing antibodies forever. They are just made to make that small wave to protect us in the first wave of protection. And that explains why when you hear the word waning, you should be really careful looking at the timing, because early on you'll get a lot of antibodies because they are coming from those short-lived cells, which makes perfect sense. Those, at the beginning, you want to block the infection, and you want to provide as much as as many antibodies in your system. So you actually drive a lot of your immune cells to differentiate to those antibody-producing cells very early on. But you also program them to be short-lived, so you don't want them to be continuing forever. If you need more, you can make more, but you don't release them if they are, unless they are programmed to be short-lived. And they produce a lot of antibodies. But then we also do something else. Our immune system actually program another set of cells that also experience recognize the antigen and the protein in the vaccine, or to recognize the infection, the virus, the spike protein of the virus. And those cells go to a special training camp in our lymph nodes. And those are the cells that now are giving the mortality, the license to be immortal. Those are our memory cells. And those are very carefully selected and trained cells. Those cells, some of them will survive in our bone marrow, and they will produce antibodies for the rest of our lives. So now those cells are licensed to live for a very long time, and they produce antibodies in a small amount, consistent amount, and these are the level of antibodies that can protect us for a long time. So this is overall very oversimplistic in a way of how our antibodies are generated and how our memory is maintained and where it is maintained in the bone marrow. And all of this will come very important for the next few slides. So once you have this, after vaccination, once you are vaccinated, you have two lines of defense, basically. You have the antibodies that, let's say you were vaccinated 6 months ago. You have antibodies that are now, in the first month, the antibodies will mainly come from these cells, the short-lived cells. These cells will die, and your antibody levels will decline, but then they will not go back to zero. What will happen is those cells now will start producing antibodies, and that will maintain a level, which we call, this is a plateau level of antibodies. And now that antibodies produced by your bone marrow plasma cells are your first line of defense. The second line of defense is those memory cells that also generated later in the response, but those cells do not produce antibodies spontaneously. They are ready to get fired up if this first line of defense is broken. So if someone got immunized and had a successful response to vaccination, so formed the two lines, the antibodies in their serum, but also formed the memory B cells. So there are two scenarios to happen, and we were just discussing before the call, someone went through that scenario. So you either get exposed to a very low inoculum of the virus, meaning that you get a very casual exposure to the virus. We don't know, but the viral particles you got into your system are very few that your antibodies handled it, the ones that produced by these long-lived plasma cells in your serum. And obviously, the first line, real first line, is at your mucosa, not really in your blood, but for this virus, but we will talk about that. So the other scenario is you got exposed to a really heavy inoculum. And that happens if you are in a closed space where someone is shedding a lot of virus and you're really breathing a lot of that virus. And that way, the number of antibodies, the number of viral particles going in will overwhelm your steady state level of antibodies that now have been produced. And in that case, we engage our memory cells. We just, basically, our first line of defense got breached, and now memory B cells get fired up, and we get into action. In the second, both cases, you would call them breakthrough, because in both cases, the virus actually managed to get in. And although in that case, it might be that you will be asymptomatic. Theoretically, you might even not feel it, or you feel very minimal symptoms. If you get to engage your memory cells, this is definitely a productive infection. The virus not only overwhelmed the first line, started replication, and engaged the memory cells, which clearly very fast would get fired up and get rid of the virus. But obviously, there will be symptoms in the first few days before those guys get enough numbers to be able to get rid of virus. So let me tell you now about the first study we did in the lab. This was the infection. And an infection, everything immune response-wise happened in this lymph nodes in draining the lung area. Remember, the virus goes through our respiratory system, and the lymph nodes in our lungs are the first places where we can actually see our immune cells will actually meet for the first time, will meet with the virus. And they will go through a lot of different cascade of different immune cells. I'm not going through details, but what I want to tell you, there's definitely a training camp that happened, and after that, we have our cells in the bone marrow. That this is in any viral infection, this is what should happen. So we learned about, shortly after the pandemic, that there's a lot of concern about that antibodies are not produced, are not long-lived. The one that people infected, and there was, if you remember, exactly a year ago, there were a lot of reports about being waning immunity after infection. And at the time, because we realized that people are measuring antibodies very early on after infection. And remember, after infection, the antibodies are coming from those short-lived cells. But really, and it's expected that they will decrease. And this is what we did here. We enrolled 77 individuals who were mildly infected, and then collected their blood samples over time, up to 11 months after this symptom onset. And as you can see here, if you measure the antibody response against SARS-CoV-2, the spike, this is in blood, IgG antibodies in the blood, very high in the beginning. And then in the first 3 months, you'll start seeing a sharp decrease. This is the decrease because of the cells, the short-lived cells are dying, because those individuals were mildly infected, so they cleared the virus. And after that, you can start even by your you can see that the virus the level is starting to stabilize. So there's no sharp decrease anymore. There's more of a plateau level, and this is because those bone marrow plasma cells started kicking in and producing antibodies that maintain our serum level. If you look at the same exact period against influenza, for example, you will see mostly flat line, because during that period there was no exposure for most of them, and there were basically all of these antibodies are coming from the plasma cells that in our bone marrow that's specific to influenza. And it's not surprising that influenza is much higher levels compared to here, because we have been exposed to influenza many times. So we call it a biphasic decay. So to really make sure that what we are seeing is coming from plasma cells, we asked our general volunteers here in St. Louis, we told them, can you allow us to look into your bone marrow 7 months after this mild infection? And we have 19 people who agreed from that study that we looked at to give us bone marrow. And we collected bone marrow from 11 people who had never tested positive. And then we asked if we see that those plasma cells in the bone marrow, this is a sign for a productive, successful immune response to that infection. And if you look in people who never tested positive or tested positive, and you look at their plasma cells, every dot here represents a plasma cell in their bone marrow against either the flu vaccine. And both of them had flu vaccine. And the different colors here is either IgG or IgA, but it doesn't matter here. For flu vaccine, for flu influenza, we always have our plasma cells present. But this is if you look at a person who never got infected with SARS, or a person who 7 months after infection, you see their plasma cells against the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2. So we definitely know we formed that compartment in our bone marrow. That means that individual will always test positive by antibody test. That individual doesn't mean that they are protected, but they definitely have the hallmark of immune memory. And this is just to show you the summary of the multiple people we did. Those are all infected with SARS. They have antibodies against the spike. Those that never exposed don't have any plasma cells against the spike, but both of them have plasma cells against the influenza antigen. So after that, and this is the study that came out 4 or 5 months ago now, and after that we know that the vaccine got introduced, and mRNA vaccines is not something that has been used in humans, but the one thing that we all agree on, they have, at least at the early stage after the pandemic, and this we are talking about, this is from phase 3 trials, the phase 3 studies, that they really have been remarkable in terms of inducing making a huge change in the incidence of severity of infection. Yeah, I'm going to skip that, but I'm going to really discuss how these vaccines work, and in a very again, oversimplistic, and it's not a very clear picture at the moment because these are new. We are still looking into this. Once you get the vaccine, we know that the main cells that take the vaccines are called dendritic cells, one of our immune cells, that will take the RNA because of the lipids where these RNA are stored in. So once these cells take the mRNA, they will start expressing the spike protein on the surface, especially in our lymph nodes, and that will lead to our immune cell recognizing there is a foreign entity on the surface of these cells, and this is how our immune response starts. And that's how, in that case, the surface is, the protein, the RNA is expressing the protein, which is the spike protein of the virus. So in our study we did, we went to our healthcare workers here at Barnes and Jewish Hospital here at St. Louis. This is the hospital associated with Washington University School of Medicine. And then they were offered the Pfizer vaccine. This was the first vaccine that was being rolled out in mid-December last year. And we asked, can we do a study where we can actually look at the impact of vaccination and response? And we had 32 individuals. This is the first batch. Right now we are up to 70. Up to 70 total. But I'm going to show you the data from the first 32. 7 of them had, because part of them are in the ER, so we had 7 of them had confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection. The remaining 25 would never been exposed, or never actually tested positive, to be more correct. Then we collected blood lymph node samples and bone marrow from those individuals over time to really dissect the details of the response. I'm going to spare you the details of the lymph node and the bone marrow for now. The lymph node data have been published 2 months ago. The bone marrow data is being prepared for publication, but I'm going to mention the data for you. But I'll show you the results from blood. So as you remember, once you are immunized, you have these short-lived plasma blasts with the cells that produce the antibodies. And this is how the data looks like. If you have never, in red, if you have never been exposed to the virus before, after the first immunization, you have some level of those and short-lived antibody-producing cells. 1 week after the second immunization, remember Pfizer is taking 2 doses 3 weeks apart, so 1 week after the second immunization, those cells increase, and then they will disappear from your blood by 7 weeks after first immunization. There's none of those cells in your blood. Remember, those are short-lived cells. People who had been infected before, their kinetics are different because now they have immune memory. So if within the first 2 weeks, what happens is they get immunized, you see the cells and they disappear quickly, but then after second immunization, you can see the response. In a clear way, you can see it here. And this is probably one of my last slides. So people have never been exposed. This is looking now at IgG antibodies against the spike protein in people either never exposed to the virus or exposed to the virus by infection before. So here's the first immunization. You get nice increase, but then you really need the second immunization after that to get the very nice boost after it. And then you start seeing the slow decay. And we have now those individuals all the way up to 30 weeks after immunization. These are the data I'm telling you that we are preparing it. So now people ask me, there are a couple of notes here that I want to mention. First is, if you note here, this is a huge spread. So one thing that we think about, and people, once you say someone is immunized or vaccine, got the Pfizer vaccine, we always wonder, we think that they're all the same. And I want to bring your attention to that. Actually, there are lots of variability between people, and that's normal. That we all respond. We have some people even respond very late, and these are perfectly healthy individuals. And relatively on the younger side, young adults. So there is a variation in human, and that's normal. Some people respond stronger than others. But then the other note that I wanted to make is people have been infected before. This is their level of antibody. But then if you give them 1 dose, they go to very high level. Their second dose doesn't really add much, but their first dose is definitely gives. And that's why I always tell, when people tell me I've been infected before, I say, you're definitely going to make benefit from a vaccination. You will get a much higher level compared to just relying on your infection. Even within infection, you can see some people get infected and still very low antibody levels. Some get higher, but both groups will benefit from that immunization, give them all the way high up. And then second one might not be as needed. Neutralization is now, this is all measuring the antibody binding to the virus. Now neutralizing the virus is a different story. Again, you need it here, as you can see, people who have been infected before, they can neutralize the virus even before vaccination, and that's not surprising. Now, after 1 dose, those individuals that have been infected before, your neutralization level shoots up in the sky. Those for us that have never been infected, we get some neutralization, but we really need the second dose to get a high level. And the one thing that's very obvious is that if you have been infected before and got immunization, and we have seen this now in clinical data, that those are the best protected category. And you can think of it as those individuals have been basically immunized 3 times. Infected first. Infection, in a way, it's a way to priming their immune response, and then they got the antigen twice. So they have been exposed for a longer period and for more times compared to the people infected. So it's not surprising that they have a higher immune response, but they needed that immunization to reach that higher level. So what did we learn? We learned that, like any normal acute viral infection, respiratory viral infection, that SARS-CoV-2 can actually induce this productive immune response in our, and we can handle it the same way we handle our different viral infections. There is nothing different about, or fundamentally different about the virus. Obviously, we learn now that this is, once you have variants, everything changed, because we trained our immune system to recognize certain features of that virus by vaccination. Now the virus changed these features, partially, not completely, partially. And that's where the problem is that now you need either to retrain our immune system, and that's what we are talking about, including additional doses. This Friday, we'll know from the FDA, a very important FDA meeting, that if this will be recommended or not. The second part is, we know that vaccines, especially this novel platform, is very strongly immunogenic. And what I can tell you, what I didn't tell you here, is that I mentioned to you here that we did look at bone marrow even 6 months later after immunization. This is the last time point we looked at yet. And it's a beautiful response in the bone marrow in those individuals, very similar to the response we saw in people who were infected. So vaccination actually works. When vaccination is mimicking infection, this means that it's a really good vaccine. And that's something that it's very impressive. We should be all proud of, because this is a very novel platform that really in my opinion, play a very important role in our fight against other viruses as well, not only just SARS-CoV-2. And we'll see this in the near future. So I don't want to take much longer time. I already talked a lot, so I'm going to thank the people in the lab here, my lab, that worked really tirelessly in the last 20 months. There is a lot of clinical partner here at the hospital that helped us in many of these studies. I get a lot of support. My lab gets a lot of funding and support from the NIH and NIAID, and there's a lot of collaborators that either inside the WashU in St. Louis or also in Sackler and Mount Sinai in New York that we help us in many innovations. And with that, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was a wonderful overview. I totally appreciate it. So I have several questions. First, just a statement for the general public and for individuals who might not have done a lot of science. Most of those curves he was showing were log curves, so the exponential curves. So the small increases are factors of 10. So that's very important to just realize that's some, really great gain there. And then the three questions I have, one is what we talked about a little tiny bit earlier, which is, could you just mention a little bit, if you know, about when we give vaccination, the mRNA was designed to create IgG and not necessarily IgA. Does the body decide to make some IgA, or do we just have some mucosal membrane IgG that's there? The second question is, could you just touch upon a little tiny bit, is the cellular immunity as opposed to humoral immunity, and what T cells do on their own, separate from that. And then the third question is, we know from the original SARS virus, 13 years ago, that a lot of those people still have good antibody response in their bodies today. In fact, it's possible that one of the reasons that Hong Kong and Malaysia and Taiwan at first, and Singapore at first, did so well with this virus until the Delta came around, that they actually were pretty well protected against the Alpha and other variants. Can you touch upon that as well? Thank you.
Sure. These are all important questions. In the IgA and IgG, that was the second question. What was the first one? Sorry for that. The IgA and IgG, the mucosal versus systemic, was the second one?
No, my first was just a statement about the log curve. Just a
yeah. Okay. So I'll go for the second one. This is you're absolutely correct. This is all log curves, and this is basically a 10-fold difference. And obviously that's why I said there's a huge benefit for getting the 2 doses, and there's a huge benefit even for those infected to get the vaccine, because that's almost getting to a 15-fold difference. So you're correct. Our immunization, especially it's systemic, it's an injection in our muscle, and it's really not designed to induce a mucosal antibody responses. what we know from studies that done many years ago, that basically there is some level of antibodies that present in the circulation that can actually reach out to the mucosa. Like you can think of it as a trickle effect that will go all the way down. So the higher antibody level you have in your blood, the higher the fraction that will show up in your mucosal level. But its estimates are rough, between like 1/10 to maybe 1/20. You know, it's a small fraction of that shows up in the mucosa, and I think it obviously helps if we have. It will help if we have a vaccine that can be given intranasal to actually induce more antibody locally, mucosally. And there are definitely trials, but they are taking much longer to prepare. So and in a way, this is it makes perfect sense for a respiratory virus to be able to if you can get more. Remember my analogy about the first line of defense and the second line of defense. If you have your first line of defense is actually your mucosal antibodies are much stronger than we have at the moment. I think even those breakthrough infection will be likely be the much milder side than what we are seeing now. But the main pathology or the main hospitalization comes from really the pneumonia of the lung, and I think there we have enough IgG and enough memory cells that can really protect from severe disease and hospitalization. So that's regarding. But this is you're absolutely correct. IgA is or mucosal IgA is something that we don't have. We have a knowledge gap now about how much we can induce by this systemic immunization. It's currently unknown. It's just for the difficulty of sampling these mucosal sites in humans. The third part about cell-mediated immunity, and this is absolutely important. Not only antibodies, we have T cells that cells that are specialized, and basically I always think of them as a neighborhood watch. They basically go to house, which is basically they go to every cell in our lining our lung, and they make sure after infection happens to make sure there is no remaining virus and kill any cell that has any virus in it to make sure that virus doesn't duplicate. And these memory cells also very important for clearing the virus and very important to make sure that we don't get very sick. And most likely that's why, for example, the 2009 pandemic, the flu, this is the last pandemic in 11 years ago. This is, or 12 years ago now. Why it's most likely that it really didn't have a huge impact is because of the T cells that we had accumulated over the years, and that's just one of the theories. Okay, so yeah, definitely we know that there's a memory T cells, and we know that these T cells contribute. It's harder to measure their contribution because it's just not as easy measured, especially in a larger population. And we think that they are even more precious or more important contribution inside the lung, which again is very hard to measure.
Fantastic. Thank you again. Dr. Sanko, you have a question. And then for the commissioners, if you have a question, please raise your hand through the raise hand bar.
Dr. Mandel and Professor Alabadi, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Hey, so Steve Sanko, I work in emergency medicine, and I was fascinated by your presentation here, especially comparing previously infected individuals versus vaccinated individuals. This is really interesting. My question is this, and it's slightly outside of topic, so I apologize, but does increasing neutralization translate into decreased shedding of virus? And if so, is there any difference between those who've been previously infected and those who've been vaccinated in terms of their propensity to shed?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to the second part, but I can tell you that there is a very nice correlation between vaccine efficacy and neutralization. So Pfizer and Moderna have been, and the mRNA-based vaccines have been very good in inducing neutralizing antibodies, and they are the highest, as we saw. Again, this is all before the Delta, before any of that. This is coming from the phase 3 trial. So we know that having neutralization is definitely good against preventing severe infection or whatever endpoint that was used to measure the efficacy. And you can think of it, yes, by extension, not really by solid data, that by extrapolation, that yes, likely that having highly neutralizing antibodies, meaning that you give the virus less chance to replicate in our upper mucosa, because now the virus will not have enough, basically you don't have enough, and the person immunized will not have enough to shed around, even if they get the breakthrough infection. So theoretically, yes. The second part is, do people infected will have a better chance of having less shedding compared to people who are fully immunized? It's a really important question, and it's a very hard one to really assess, especially on a community level. There's a lot of there are lots of problems of these analyses because people infected are usually certain populations, certain demographics, and people. So there is a lot of just hard to really pin to have a study that's so clean that you can compare these two populations where people that have been just infected or just vaccinated and have been exposed to at the same time to something like Delta, and then do the study. I mean, we know that there are some data coming out that's showing that having been fully vaccinated, having been infected and vaccinated is always shows up the best in terms of everything. Severity of infection in terms of symptomatic infection, everything is. It seems that having fully vaccinated 2 doses does slightly better than infection. But again, this is depends on really what's your readout. And then having 1 dose is inferior to infection, so infection seems to be much better than infection. Theoretically, infection is, in a way, introduces those mucosal antibody responses and memory cells that we actually will be, in terms of location, better positioned to actually prevent more disease. But as I said, it's just such a hard way to assess that point. And again, not everyone, and the other thing that not everyone infected, it's even more variable in terms of responses to infection compared to vaccination, because infection really depends on how severe that infection was. Some people get mild, moderate, or severe, and you get different immune profile with each one of those, and depending on age and many other factors, and immune health status, and generally, this is really hard to control. So there's more variables for that kind of study. So it's really hard. But theoretically, infection should be, in a way, better positioned to prevent the local infection there, especially at the initial stage.
Thank you.
Vice President Grimick, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your presentation. I just had a question, excuse me, about, you said you have data now for, I think you said 32 weeks out. And I was just curious if you could share, I'm curious how much further, as far as the vaccine, if you've seen that response continue to drop and by how much. And then curious your thoughts on, boosters. Obviously, I'm assuming you think that the antibody response would go up again, like the second shot, but do you think this is something that continually down the road will be a continual type of booster situation, or a third booster you'd be good for a much longer period of time? Just curious your thoughts on that as well. Thank you.
These are important questions. So we have, what we are seeing right now, we think we reached to this plateau level after vaccination. We are 6 to 8 months now. And we are thinking, after the first immunization, we think we have reached really the plateau level where we are seeing a stable level of antibodies not decaying much. And I said this is similar to what we saw after infection, 7, 8 months after infection. So really the data, the clinical data are very clear that vaccination, even 2 doses of at least the mRNA vaccines, are really holding up, even against Delta. They are doing well, and that's really clear. And I think that's what's making the decision coming on Friday very hard, And this is why we hear about some differences in opinion, even within the FDA and the government and the federal authorities about the really. It's really hard to see because the vaccine is doing well. We do see breakthroughs, and then the question is, I think we should have set the expectation that this is something will happen, especially if you have a very, I would say, very clever, although it could be worse, but very clever variant like the Delta, where it's actually acquired the ability to replicate very fast, even if it's not very clever in evading the immunity, but it has really, can basically hit and run really quickly and then move on and doesn't cause a severe disease, but can move on to more people. And that's the virus's strategy, at least. And it has been working. But at the same time, from a vaccine standpoint, the vaccine is still working because we are not having increased use of hospitalization among the fully vaccinated. So a third immunization will certainly increase our level of immunity. I don't have any doubt that I don't think it will hurt or it will harm in any way, except obviously if there's any undesirable side effects and we have seen that it's very, very minimal. But I think that it will benefit. We will benefit immunologically. I think we would have been even. I would have preferred that if there is a third shot, that it's become based on the variant and not really based on the same sequence from the original virus that we know now is not circulating anymore. It's completely replaced by Delta and by other variants. So I would have preferred that this third shot is actually based on the variants to actually basically train our immune system on the new features of the virus circulating. That would have been my preference. Although that I know that there's certain sections of the population, like the immunocompromised, immunosuppressant, people on immunosuppressive drugs, and the very elderly, they would benefit from a third shot. I have no doubt about that. And clinically and immunologically. So whether now this will be something for the future, yeah, it's hard. I wish if I had that crystal ball to actually be able to say that this will not be. I mean, from an immune standpoint, I don't see any reason for us to really, with how good the vaccines are, I don't see any reason why we would need anything after, if we take the third shot, if we need anything within a year. But then I have to admit I was wrong before because I never expected something like Delta to come. I always thought that, unless something that really evades the immune very strongly, will be good. We didn't need a third shot. But Delta has really proved me wrong. So I really don't, I can tell you from an immunological perspective that, yes, I don't see a reason even we need anything after a year from the third shot. But if the virus keeps changing with that rate and produce even a more clever variant, then I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Commissioner Cotto. Ron, you have to unmute.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Elibeti, for taking the time with us. You talked about the benefits of taking the 2 boosters for those that were infected first. What about the case of those that took the 2 boosters first and then got infected? And for those that have gotten infected and have the 2 shots, would that booster be necessary?
Well, for those who got the 2 immunization, then luckily got a mild infection after that. From immunological perspective, I would say they are set. They are even set more than anyone because now they got both components. They got the vaccine systemically and they got the mucosal component. Now they are set. Obviously, I saw some smiles here, but it doesn't mean that you are completely. We don't know what's coming, but at least if someone got infected recently, that's Delta for sure, given the prevalence, and that means that we have seen so far. So that's good. For those again infected and vaccinated, if I had, and this is not something in my basically above my pay scale, if I had, I would say those should be the least of the least in terms of priority to get vaccinated. Individuals who actually had mild infection, then vaccinated, or vaccinated have mild infection. Those by definition should be really all the way in the back in terms of getting a vaccine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, and we truly appreciate and are honored that you come to present to us. You are welcome to stay on and listen to the other presentations if you want. We won't take it personal, and I know that Dr. Sanko in Cone will not take it personal if you drop off, being that it's fairly late and you have a busy schedule tomorrow. But you are welcome to stay, and if you do, you're welcome to ask questions afterwards. It's with great pleasure that we can go on to back to our regular agenda. Agenda item number 1 with the presentation from our acting medical director of the LA Fire Department and Emergency Medical Services, emergency room clinically practicing emergency physician and interim medical director, as well as assistant professor at the Keck School of Medicine, Emergency Medicine. It's with great pleasure to invite Stephen Sanko. Dr. Sanko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Mandel. Can you hear me? Great, and as well to the rest of the commission, thank you very much for having me. Ali, it's a tough lecture to follow. I appreciate your time. I don't know if you're still on there, but I think this is particularly, what you were talking about was particularly relevant to our challenges in the EMS Bureau, because we don't know if we have a number of unvaccinated super spreaders who have perhaps been exposed or not exposed in the past, who are taking care of vulnerable patients on a daily basis. And so the comparison between the neutralizing in terms of neutralization and shedding and those who've been infected versus those that are vaccinated, I think is highly relevant clinically. So thank you. Again, Steve Sanko, I'm a doctor in emergency medicine. I work at LA County USC. I am acting medical director with LA City Fire Department, and I stand in the shadow of a recently retired incredible EMS medical director, Dr. Mark Eckstein, who's worked with you guys in the past. Mark was medical director here for the last 25 years. He's a friend and mentor. He was my fellowship director in emergency medical services, and the number of innovations that he's introduced into the city and the number of people whose lives he's touched is truly remarkable. And so it's with no small degree of humility that I'm quickly learning how many different pots he had his hands in and how many different ways he affected the health of this city. And so if there are any questions I'm unable to answer, it's because I don't have nearly the experience that he does. However, I'll certainly do my best. My hope today is to provide a little bit of context to our 911 response system today in September 2021, help you understand what's happened with COVID, some of our current challenges, and what we hope for in the future of emergency medical response. Emergency medical response, EMS, refers to 911 care for patients who are trying to access the emergency medicine system. LAFD is one of the largest providers of acute unscheduled care in the county of Los Angeles. Most people don't realize. They think of health systems as being Kaiser or other large systems, perhaps Cedars or DHS. But LAFD receives well over 1 million calls a year for help, and evaluates and treats about 500,000 patients a year, which is no small number. And whereas in these other hospital systems we have large numbers of physician teams, we have right now one half-time doctor who's trying to fill in for a previously well-experienced full-time doctor. In terms of the volume that we faced, what this figure shows is that over the years we've had relatively stable, steady increases in our volume of EMS incidents. And so historically, year to year, we would increase our number of calls for 911 help about 1 to 2% a year. Starting around 2011, 2012, we had an acceleration in that. And so we were increasing our volume 3%, 4%, in 1 year 8%. And it's unclear exactly why this was happening. What we were seeing was also at the same time was an increasing percent decisions. There's a larger number of decisions being made by EMTs and paramedics as opposed to doctors as to the disposition of these patients that were calling 911. And as you can see in the figure below, the percent annual changes are fairly steady, increased slightly between around 2012 to 2016, and then we have a sudden drop with the onset of COVID. And so before I get to what happened during the year of COVID, I want to dive a little bit more into what was going on just before then. We were able to identify some select groups within whom 911 was becoming more commonly used. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see men. In the upper right-hand corner, women. And we clearly see two age groups, one lower age, maybe late 20s, early 30s, and then a later group, typically around the late 50s all the way to early 70s. The younger groups were typically dealing with things like substance use disorder, mental health exacerbation, whereas the older groups were dealing with some of these same things, but also higher incident counts with minor trauma. That we did locally here, both within our system and with neighboring systems, we were starting to appreciate that some of the drivers of 911 use were things that you would expect: increased economic disparity, increased counts of people experiencing homelessness, decreased access to primary and preventative care with fewer clinics in certain areas of the city where we were seeing this growth, transportation barriers. It isn't uncommon today to talk to emergency patients in my ED who have traveled 2 hours or more in bus with kids in tow to be seen. And so it's not surprising that faced with that challenge, many people would delay care, delay filling prescriptions. You also have issues of food deserts, food scarcity, poor coping mechanisms, decreased access to mental health and substance use disorder. And also, I think a sleeper but important issue that's affecting our business is the swelling number of patients who are reaching Medicare age or are graduating to retirement, who we project over the next 20 years will probably make up between 70 and 80% of all of our growth. Bears repeating that we anticipate that a lot of our growth in the next 20 years will be driven by seniors here in LA City. And so some of the take-home points prior to COVID, Angelinos were using 911 in different ways. A lot of it had to do with this, okay? If you can call and get help right away that shows up dependably, why wait, right? We saw disproportionate growth in select areas of the city, among select age groups, and in particular with issues such as substance use disorder, mental health, and minor traumatic injuries. And so with that as a backdrop, last year, with the onset of COVID around the 10th or 11th week of the year, we saw a brisk decrease in the number of EMS incidents. I think people in California were responding in many ways to what we were seeing on TV, going on in Italy, going on in New York City, with hospitals inundated, and these horrific reports of what was going on with our EMS systems. And so many people stayed away. We had a 20% near immediate decrease in our number of EMS incidents. That said, we also had persistent case counts for things like substance use disorder, mental health exacerbations, and we had an increasing prevalence of really sick people, people with cardiac arrest, people who were severely septic in shock, and of note, we had a marked increase in our number of out-of-hospital cardiac arrests, and especially subsets of those, including those that were beyond help upon our arrival, people that were cold and dead in a warm place who had been dead for some time, and also people who were experiencing homelessness. So this is a figure that just kind of helps demonstrate that. When we talk about cardiac arrest, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, this is slightly different but related to the concept of a heart attack. In essence, you have complete cardiovascular collapse and your heart no longer produces enough squeeze to generate a pulse, and you're not perfusing your heart or brain, and this is the archetypal time-critical emergency around which 911 systems are predicated. If we can activate the chain of survival and get there within moments and start bystander CPR and restart the heart, in some cases we can save patients. And so what you can see in this figure is that while the total number of EMS-attended cardiac arrests was stable over the 3 years preceding COVID, what we see with the first year of COVID is a marked increase in the number of EMS-not-treated cardiac arrests, those who were unfortunately beyond help by the time we arrived. And so this burden was disproportionately borne also by people experiencing homelessness. You can see here amongst EMS-treated cardiac arrest patients, there was a 28% year-to-year increase in cardiac arrest. However, there was a 200% increase in the number of homeless individuals who were untreated. In other words, we found them just unfortunately way too late. The new reality that we've now started to settle into in 2021 is that we've had, with increasing vaccination rates around LA County, we have had a return to people going outside, a return to confident use in 911, and in essence, we're back to our pre-COVID EMS incident and transport volumes. So we handle around 1,600 to 1,700 incidents a day and 600 to 700 transports a day. Of note, even though we're back to our pre-COVID numbers, we do have a higher prevalence of our highest acuity incident types. So we continue to see a large number of cardiac arrests. Also, Angelinos are out this summer in force, and we've seen a tremendous bounce back in the amount of penetrating trauma. We've also seen a big uptick in the number of intoxications due to novel opioids like fentanyl, as well as mixed intoxications. And the hospitals dealing with patients coming back from being gone for a year are saturated at capacity, even in the waning days of Delta variant here, which in turn has led to increased ambulance patient offload times or wall times. And that's also, all of this occurs in the context of many of our providers, our pre-hospital providers, being exhausted from this last year, always having to gown up, use PPE nonstop, day after day, shift after shift, and seeing a lot of people quite ill and dead, and being worried about taking this back to their families. And so we've had challenges in terms of understanding and addressing provider resilience. And so what you can see here is that as of the 9th of this last month, the number of known COVID infections that we've registered amongst our members here in the fire department is just over 1,070. The vast majority have returned to work. We still have members who are periodically put on leave or in isolation, and we had a total of 2 individuals who unfortunately succumbed to their infections. There has been much in the press recently about our vaccination rates amongst our members. The most latest information that we have is that those who are considered fully vaccinated, based on the use of either J&J or 2 doses of an mRNA virus, is around 59%, and those who have received at least one vaccination is just over 65%. So where do we go from here? I've painted you a picture of a return in our volume, and I've also described how we had a brisk increase several years ago in people using 911. We weren't, over a 5-year period from 2012 to 2016, we had an unprecedented 20% increase in our volume, which if we were a private business would have been fantastic. if any of you could have invested in LAFD, that might have been a good play back then, right? Unfortunately, we weren't receiving 20% more stations, personnel, ambulances, and so we had to get more creative with how we were addressing this surge in especially lower acuity calls for help that had much to do with social determinants of health. And so some of the things that we know is we were able to leverage technology in order to meet these needs. So under the guidance of Dr. Eckstein, I was actually involved in the work group that created our new dispatch system. For those of you who don't know, a dispatch system is the system of questions and emergency instructions that we provide when people call 911. And by asking these more efficiently, we were actually able to decrease the number of resources that were sent while maintaining a high degree of accuracy and efficiency in treating, in particular, our high acuity patients. We were also able to leverage this new dispatch system to help combat health disparities, including in cardiac arrest, by recruiting more callers with limited English proficiency to participate in telecommunicator-assisted CPR and start chest compressions before help arrived. And we're confident that this has had a positive effect and increased the number of survivors that have ultimately walked out of the hospital. And so our goal now, as we recover from what we believe were the worst days of COVID, is to continue our focus on providing outstanding EMS care. And so organize updates to our homegrown LA TDS, our new dispatch system. Also, we have other large projects. We are focused on successful implementation of a new electronic health record. We're focusing in on reinforcing and affecting translation medicine for evidence-based care treatments for our time-critical emergencies like improved care for cardiac arrest, acceptable and proactive education, so trying to meet our members where they are and understand how they learn and how we can most effectively provide not only continued education, back to the basics education, but also just-in-time learning when it's needed most. We're interested in embracing a just culture philosophy and approach to case review so that we can learn from significant events in the past and do a better job of moving forward as opposed to having members feel threatened by discussing difficult cases, more of a model of what happens in the hospital. This was from a paper Mark and I published in the New England Journal Catalyst earlier this year. On the far left, you can see the traditional you call, we haul model of EMS. And what this speaks to is that times are changing in emergency medical services. And it's time to not only introduce color in what we do, but also think about how we can leverage our position and incorporation of different types of care providers in order to navigate patients to alternative destinations, treat people where they are, get them plugged back into their patient-centered medical homes, and ultimately help keep our system efficient, keep our resources available for time-critical emergencies while doing the best by our patient. And so this reflects some of the novel approaches that we've come up with over the last few years, including using advanced practice providers, training paramedics to a higher level, what we call alternate destination response units, to allow them to take patients to places besides an emergency department, and also incorporation of telemedicine, which we think is really exciting and a potential game changer. And so moving forward, this concept of mobile integrated healthcare, we would like to call MIH, or Mobile Integrated Healthcare 2.0. So we hope to reinforce and expand our number of units that you guys have heard about on this commission in the past. We plan to pivot a little bit more towards telemedicine, which will allow us to be present for on-scene decision-making in a way that we haven't been before, including having doctors and advanced practice providers, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants available immediately, visually, both to EMTs, paramedics, together with patients and families who can tap into that million-dollar moment when we decide, do we need to go to the hospital, or is there something else we can do that's much more patient-centered? Commissioner Histerick, I believe you had a question. I'm happy to answer now, if you'd like.
I'll wait until you're finished, okay? Thank you. I just put my hand up to be sure I was in the queue.
Some of the other things we see mobile integrated healthcare doing is leveraging technology and just-in-time information to vastly improve our patient navigation activities. And so under CMS's meaningful use rules, hospitals and hospital systems are required to connect their EHRs in a way that helps to decrease redundant testing. So if I went to an emergency department yesterday and got 20 CT scans, and I show up to a different one the next day, I should be able to access that information in a low barrier way and identify who that patient belongs to, who's their payer, who's their primary care doctor, where do they live, how do I talk to their family, what meds they're on. And there's no reason that our folks, our advanced practice providers, shouldn't be able to do the same. And so we're looking at linking up with a local health information exchange to that end in the same way that our community health clinics have been doing. Also navigating patients with discrete issues like who are dealing with opioid use disorder to medication-assisted treatment, and perhaps incorporating actually a patient navigator to assist with these activities. We're also interested in pursuing a model of sustainability whereby we enter into new contracts with local payers, in particular those involved in Medi-Cal, so that we can get compensation, even if it's minimal for these cases, and make our use of these new technologies more sustainable. And then lastly, we want to be on message with other providers in terms of the need for crisis stabilization centers for mental health, as well as sobering centers, in particular in the Valley. We also plan to improve our efforts in community risk reduction. And so one thing that we haven't done a good job in the past is really demonstrating what we learned to other folks within the EMS Bureau, other providers in the field, as well as other community stakeholders. And so our goal is to launch an internal and external facing EMS Bureau website. And one of the activities would be sharing geolocation information in particular for events of public health import. And what does that mean? Well, here's just an example. You can see here areas of the city where we know there are chronic high rates of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and chronic low rates of bystander CPR. And so looking at this from a census tract level that doesn't threaten sharing, private health information, it allows us to guide the conversation of where CPR should be taught and among whom we should be trying to better understand, how come it's not being learned, how can we better connect with our population and promote these types of activities when it matters most. There's no reason that these same types of maps couldn't be generated, in fact, very easily for other intervenable diseases that affect our populations, including things like asthma exacerbations, gun violence, so we can provide very community-focused trauma-informed care, opioid intoxication, so we can best locate needle exchanges and leave behind programs for naloxone. There are many examples where EMS data would be very impactful for public health campaigns. And so this was one other look of how bystander CPR changed during COVID. Suffice to say that some of our areas with chronic low bystander CPR actually didn't change very much. However, the rest of the city did. And so we're learning a lot about how people behave under these types of new circumstances that's going to inform how we approach public health campaigns in the future. Some other ideas that we have in terms of community risk reduction are using social workers for referral of select high utilizers of 911, which Dr. Eckstein I know has spoken on in the past, and also joining DHS's inpatient, not inpatient, but inpatient resuscitation effort for a cardiac arrest survivor network. And so take-home point, the question came up before about forming a health department within the city. I would argue that LAFD is not only legally a health agency, but it's in fact a very big one. I think one of the problems is we don't bring a kind of physician epidemiologist thought process to its future direction. And this is an area where we could clearly impact the lives of many people who depend on 911, in particular those in in socioeconomically challenged areas. And so some recommendations that we have both for you to consider as well as our other policymakers in the city are what follows. So continued managerial development of the EMS Bureau, having a half-time doc overseeing a 500,000 incident a year program doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We need to build out the infrastructure a little bit. Dr. Eckstein started along this path, but we need to continue to carry the torch, and here are some discrete ways that we could do that. I'll leave that for you guys to take a look at. Also building up a modern medical leadership. Other cities of comparable size, for example, Houston, Atlanta, Boston, New York, many of these have 6, 7, in some cases 9 medical directors involved in EMS, in overseeing EMS care to ensure high quality education for paramedics, progressive mobile integrated healthcare programs, efficient practice of dispatch medicine, and effective outreach to other community stakeholders. We have one here in LA, and so maybe there's room for improvement. Part of that would involve offering competitive compensation for clinicians. The doctor's salary that's being offered for this position is $150,000, which is an awful lot of money, but it's also not quite competitive with what a typical emergency medicine doctor makes. Also, and very importantly, our EMS educators, nurses, nurse practitioners, who are highly talented and who provide the day-to-day teaching to our members in the field in response to complex incidents, are underpaid to the tune of $30,000 to $50,000 compared to our colleagues in the county fire department. So we're constantly losing our expertise once we, are able to attract them over to us. And so this is going to constantly be to the detriment of Angelenos until we can address it. And then continued use and implementation of other alternate resources, including fast response vehicles and additional advanced practice response units. And then the last thing I'd leave you with is that one thing that I think Mayor Garcetti did very effectively, and the team around him did, was institute this City Innovation Fund, which was incredibly helpful to several areas, including the EMS Bureau, because it allowed us to stand up for the first time some of these novel interventions and test them and see what was appropriate for our community and what didn't pass muster. And so if this is something that were to continue in the future, including under other administrations, these are some of the things that we could clearly implement in the not too distant future. Performing a needs assessment for having a social worker to oversee our referral of high utilizers who impact our system and make up probably 1% to 2% of all our EMS volume. Introduction of a patient navigator. Advanced care for seniors and training programs for our medics dedicated to how we can better interact and more safely interact with people experiencing homelessness, people who are suffering with substance use disorder. And then getting additional funds to implement a way whereby we could share our data more effectively with community stakeholders, including academicians, based on location, based on census tract area, and some of the issues that I named before. And so with that, I am open to questions, and I truly appreciate your time and the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'll get out of the presentation so that we can see everybody's faces. That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Let me make one statement, and then I'll ask my questions after Commissioner Hisserick, being that he was so nice to raise his hand. And eager, and also for his dedication for working with LA Fire Department during his professional career. I'd just like to make a statement that it's been 20 years since September 11th, and that on behalf of the Commission and the people of Los Angeles, I want to publicly thank all the first responders and the members of the fire department, EMS, other professionals in your division and departments for all they have done for us since the creation of the city, and how much we rely on them for our health and safety, as not just you guys, but also the first responders throughout America. Our population is really in awe of how hard you work, and we're humbled by the dedication, and for those individuals who chased up those towers, how they fought to save individuals, putting their lives literally on the line. So I thank you for all you do, and I'll give the floor to Commissioner Hisrick.
Thank you, Dr. Mandel. Excuse me. Dr. Sanko, thank you. You did a wonderful job in Eckstein. You picked up the baton beautifully and informed us well. As you pointed out and alluded to, the fact that between 30 and 40% of your personnel are not fully vaccinated, or in some instances vaccinated at all, how are you going to cope with having to meet the mandate that's now in the state and soon to be federally, that healthcare workers have to be vaccinated? Now, the paramedics clearly are healthcare workers. I don't know what percentage of them are vaccinated, but every firefighter is an EMT, and as we know, they respond on the engine or the truck along with the ambulance in many instances, interact with people, that many of whom are quite vulnerable. How is that going to be dealt with in the near term and the long term?
Thank you, Commissioner. This is a big challenge for the fire department. I think the status of it right now is it's being treated as a labor issue, and the mayor's administration, I know, is in close communication with UFLAC, CAO, and discussing. Basically, I think the meat of the matter is, if I understand this correctly, is what recourse does the city have if a healthcare provider, an EMT or paramedic, insists on showing up to work to take care of patients and refuses to accept immunization? And I think that is the big question that's going to be teased out kind of in a labor law perspective. Okay. What I can tell you is that at least in the 1 month that I have been filling in as acting medical director, but also over the last 7 years that I've been working with Dr. Eckstein here at LA Fire in the capacity of assistant medical director and getting to know many of the members throughout the city, we have smart guys. We have folks who have strong beliefs for one reason or another, and we also have folks who have had rants on YouTube that have been publicized. But I would say the vast majority of our members are dedicated and thoughtful and caring providers. And so I think it would be a mistake to, and I'm speaking as a doctor, I think it would be a mistake to say that we need a stick more than anything else to deal with this. I think what we truly need is to better understand the reservations that these individuals have in terms of getting vaccinated. And it may be that we don't have enough time to do that before this is adjudicated by the mayor's office. But I think people have an awful lot of questions about that sound like the following. If I have been taking care of patients on most days for the last year and a half, including managing acute airways for sick COVID patients, and I've had mild illness at most, and I'm still doing pretty well, why do I need this vaccination? And thus my questions to our last presenter: what do we know about shedding, neutralizing antibodies, etc.? My response to these is frequently, hey, if you're not protected, the likelihood is that you have increased shedding amongst other patients, including perhaps my family members or your family members. And I don't think that aligns with outstanding emergency medical service care. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of understanding what they're going to do. There are plans in the works within the fire department to increasingly offer immunization and testing. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to a decision, a labor decision in terms of what discipline, what recourse there is in terms of discipline, and whether or not these individuals can work.
Thank you. Do you think that over the long haul that the increasing sophistication required to do this work, as well as I've mentioned to you, the increasing complexity of firefighting, the more technical aspects of it, may bode some change or require some change in the recruitment of folks to be in the fire department? Now, you know, as I say, you have to be able to pick up a 35-foot wooden ladder as opposed to doing some other skills that may be more on point for what 85 to 90% of the work of the department is, which is healthcare.
I think it would be, that's a great point. I think it would be wise of us to feed our difficulties back into the tower, something we've already actually started to do, and prepare the expectations for new members coming in and the selection criteria, which should follow as well, that somebody passing through the training tower should be just as adept at running into a burning building as they are at assessing judgment-making capacity, holding an elderly lady's hand and helping her count her pills, having the patience to deal with somebody who speaks other languages and is trying to communicate what may be a very subtle but emergent condition. And I think many of these new skills are going to be required. And perhaps like one of our prior CIA directors said, the ideal member is somebody who's a Harvard graduate who can also hold his own in a bar fight. I think we're looking for somebody who can both throw the ladder as well as have the patience and sophistication and equipoise to truly be a caring provider in the field, because as we saw before, they're increasingly making decisions in the field that affect whether or not patients receive further care from physicians or follow up in a different setting.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mandel.
Thank you.
And Dr. Sanko, of course.
So a few questions. One is you alluded a little tiny bit to the frequent flyers, those individuals who are either homeless and or have chronic conditions and need to be evaluated and or transported on a regular basis. And previously we've looked at the numbers of those individuals, including the cost to the system. Is there any updated information that you have that you can present to us? And if you don't have it off the top of your head, no problem if you can get back to us with the numbers. But what percentage of the total costs of your department are generated by frequent flyers? What percentage of that is billable to a third party, whether it be a Medicare or a Medicaid? And what's the loss to the city on those individuals on an annual basis?
I'm happy to bring more detailed information back to you at the next meeting. What I can tell you is that after implementation of ACA, a number of these individuals moved, because of so many touches with the healthcare system, they moved from the uninsured category to the Medi-Cal category, or received some kind of emergency care, including from private payers who had different lines of products that it just became more advantageous for them to have some kind of emergency health insurance. And so I'm not sure what the loss is. What I can tell you is we did see from the years of about 2014 to 2018 a market increase in our super users, in other words, not just our high utilizers who have more than 5 incidents in any 12-month period, but those who have 15 or more incidents within a year. We saw like a 450% increase amongst those individuals, and those individuals in particular had a high propensity to become chronic users of emergency medical services. Based on that data, I was actually spearheading an effort to create a memorandum of understanding between the City of LA and the County of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Health Agency, so that we could refer our highest utilizers to DHS as well as to DMH. DMH Emergency Outreach is the office that receives our regular monthly reports on these individuals. They are a large bureaucracy, and they do not always, I dare say, I'm not entirely sure what the effect of transmitting this information is to them. However, it has generated increasing discussions about the gaps in wraparound care and full-service partnerships and the process of conservation that has led to further downstream conversations. And so I'm hopeful that now that DMH in particular, under the prompting of the Board of Supervisors, is mobilizing a alternate crisis response evaluation process with many stakeholders, that this year is taking a better look at how to manage high utilizers with mental health issues, that high utilizers are going to get more attention. But unfortunately, this is not an easy nut to crack, and it's going to take a village.
Great, thank you. And if you could, maybe over the next couple of months, work with our research associates, if you can get us actual raw data and numbers that we can kind of look at and get your opinion on that, so that when we make our annual report to the City Council and the Mayor's office and the public at large, that we can have the most up-to-date data. That would be appreciated. Second question is a two-part question, basically related to when paramedics go out to automobile accidents. How comfortable are you in knowing that that data is then given to the Department of Transportation? And then separately, would you believe that it would be a good idea if the City of Los Angeles would lobby the state to mandate that insurance companies would notify your department as well as the Department of Transportation, so that we could see the locations of the most accidents, whether they be motor vehicle versus motor vehicle or motor vehicle versus a pedestrian or bicycle?
I would strongly be supportive of that kind of mandated data sharing. I think it has significant public health import in terms of helping us to mitigate the effect of accidents, autoped accidents, and also decrease their overall numbers. And I think there are other safety benefits that would come from it as well. The fire department, interestingly, is probably one of the best situated groups to argue on behalf of that mandate, just because we have such finite or such a specific geolocation information for all of our incidents. However, it's not complete, and I believe you're absolutely right that I think our insurance companies have a lot more information that could be used to benefit the public if it were properly shared.
Excellent. And then as long as we're talking about geolocation, you held up a cell phone beforehand. We know that Uber can pick you or I up, knowing exactly where we are and where the nearest location is. Would it be beneficial to your department as well as the people of the City of Los Angeles if we had a opt-out system so that every single cell phone would directly link to 911 / emergency service line, and that people wanted privacy and didn't want to have that link, they could turn it off, but we would then have the ability when somebody was really ill or if there was other violent crime, for example, that our professionals would know exactly where they are.
Yeah, acknowledging that there are privacy issues related to that, I can tell you that we have incidents every single day where we have challenges locating individuals. It may be a grandmother who is watching her life partner suffer a heart attack or cardiac arrest and can't remember the numbers on her cell phone or provide her exact location at that moment. It can even be a well-known store. However, we're unsure exactly where the location is within a thick building. And having out system, as you said, where people are automatically linked to this for emergency call types, would certainly decrease response times, increase our efficiency to respond to, in particular, time-critical emergencies, and overall increase the efficiency of our system, getting our ambulances to help and patients to the emergency department and our units free again.
Well, that might be something for us to consider both in our report, make a recommendation that we can discuss at another time as a commission at large, so we don't keep our other presenter waiting. I don't see any other questions. Seeing no other questions, I want to thank you again, and also thank your entire department for what they do for the people of the city of Los Angeles. We're really beholden to the dedication, the education, training, experience of the firefighters and paramedics and the service that you do, and we're indebted to you. And thank you for what you do in their leadership. So we look forward to working with you, hopefully for many, many years, like we do with Dr. Eckstein. And please feel free to come back and or let us know if there's ways we can help you or your department. And we look forward to having our research associates reach out to you so that we can make sure our report has the best accurate data. So thank you very much. Again, you're welcome to stay on if you like. I realize you have young children and you might want to leave, but I can guarantee you that the next speaker has a fantastic presentation that is very relevant to the public health of people of Los Angeles. So you're welcome to join and ask questions for that too. And with that, we can move on to the second agenda of the regular scheduled meeting. It is with great pleasure to invite Professor Ronald Cohn, who's going to speak on air pollution, health, and how that comes together. And then just for the city clerk, please note that I think maybe one or two of other commissioners joined in over the last 40 minutes. I'm not sure if you noted when they came in, but for the record that we should note that they were in attendance for the last speaker. Thank you.
Let me start by saying those are two incredibly hard acts to follow. Those were fabulous talks, and I learned a lot in both of them. So I hope I can, in something much less medical, that I can do some good here. I'm trained as a chemist. I'm now a chemist and an earth scientist, and I go about my work by measuring the contents of the air. So much as the first speaker tonight talked about measuring, specific contents of blood to think about immunity, I measure the specific chemicals in air to think about what's happening in the air. And I start that as a curiosity-driven scientist. But I know that because what I work on is air pollution and climate, that there are important health and public policy dimensions to that. I am by no means an epidemiologist or a public health expert or an expert in the mechanics of weather and climate, but I dabble enough that I think I can speak your language a little bit, so I'll try. But know that I'm coming at it from a fundamental chemistry, atmospheric chemistry perspective and trying to do an appropriate translation. So I want to talk, and I should say, I'm going to speak almost entirely about summer. Wintertime issues are different. In the winter, people in Los Angeles are exposed to high aerosol, mostly because it gets cold and the air is really still, and so things accumulate. But in the summer, there's chemistry, and so so there's four connected issues when we think about the air. Los Angeles is the home to photochemical smog. That's where the idea of photochemical smog was first discovered. It's been the origin of some of the most sophisticated and effective policies for reducing smog on the planet. And that's really about ozone. It's also about particles. We refer to PM 2.5. Those are particles of the size that penetrate deep into your lungs. But But there's two other things that are closely related to that. There's issues of environmental justice, so the spatial pattern of pollutants. So people whose residences are within 250 meters or 500 meters of the highway are much more exposed to primary pollutants than other people. And because of historic redlining, the people who are living within 250 meters of highways tend to be people who are poor and people of color. And that's also true for people who live in the near vicinity of various kinds of industrial facilities. And then at the same time as we think about those three issues that have to do with air quality and health, greenhouse gas emissions are driving all kinds of other things, and we're committed to reducing the worst impacts of climate by reducing our emissions of CO2 and also methane and black carbon. And almost all of the things that contribute to poor air quality are co-emitted with CO2 because they're actions related to combustion or manufacturing that release CO2 to the atmosphere. So those problems are intertwined, although they proceed almost entirely in parallel with different research and policy communities thinking about CO2 and air quality, even though the two things are deeply, deeply connected. So that's the background for what we should be thinking about together. And then let me just say the ingredients for making ozone or particles they're both similar. Those ingredients are organic chemicals, things that are gases that find their way into the atmosphere, nitrogen oxides, sunlight, and then somewhat sulfated ammonia. But it's really those first two that I want to talk about today, volatile organic chemicals and nitrogen oxides. And just if you're going back to this talk for reference, a lot of what I'll say comes from these two publications last year where we looked in some detail at the connection between temperature and high aerosol and temperature and high ozone in Los Angeles. And there's sort of a lay PR from NOAA that might be useful. So again, Los Angeles has done this extraordinary effort and effective effort to control air pollution. Some combination of direct things in LA, state of California, the effectiveness of the Clean Air Act nationally. A big piece of that is catalytic converters attached to passenger vehicles. And because of the application of catalytic converters, reduction of organic chemical emissions from passenger cars has been extraordinarily effective. And so, I mean, so this is measurements from a site in Los Angeles of the total amount measured as the part in a billion carbon of the air. And in 2000, just, not even to go back to the early 60s when this decrease started, but in 2000 there was about 300, and today there's about 50 in these units. It's an extraordinary accomplishment that we've managed to reduce the concentration of organic chemicals in the atmosphere in this way. You'll notice that the rate of decrease is kind of slowing. We put an exponential on this, not a linear decrease. And we think that's mostly because the contributions from vehicles are continuing to decrease as a percentage, something like 7% per year, but we're reaching a background where the emissions of organic chemicals to the atmosphere from other processes are starting to become more and more important. Right? So somewhere in this vicinity right here, around 25 or 40, all kinds of other sources of organic chemicals are becoming what matters to the atmosphere. And let me just say that, atmospheric chemists are starting to be able to say a little bit about what those are. There's two categories. One category are emissions of organic chemicals from trees when they're otherwise photosynthesizing. They release reactive chemicals as a byproduct of that. And then the other are what we call a class of volatile chemical products. And those are, both household and business cleaners. The poster child for that is the limonene smell in your household cleaners or similar sort of smells that are added to industrial cleaners. But it's also the personal deodorant, the shampoo. If you go out with sophisticated new atmospheric chemistry technology, you can see in the morning that the personal care products we use in the morning are evaporating into the atmosphere, and there's more of them in morning rush hour than there is in evening rush hour. So all those other chemicals are starting to be a not insignificant part because cars are so unbelievably clean. And that's nitrogen oxides are, in some sense, a simpler story. We don't really have much nitrogen oxide emissions from our homes. That would be, a little bit from water heaters or other sort of natural gas burners, but it's really not very much. Nitrogen oxides are today, they're about half from cars and half from trucks. So let me just show you some examples of measurements of these that also show the extraordinary success in control of nitrogen oxides. What you're looking at here is a measurement from space of the total amount of nitrogen oxides between the surface and the top of the atmosphere. And you can see, individual cities show up and light up. This is a 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant. That's another coal-fired power plant, Phoenix, Los Angeles. And so this was in the summer of 2005, 2006. Here we are 7 years later in 2012, 2013. You can see this extraordinary success. Here the success is two parts. It's catalytic converters on cars and also controls over the coal-fired power plants in the Ohio River Valley. But the other thing you can see is that a tremendous amount of the emissions are associated with trucks. So heavy-duty trucks drive much, much less on the weekend. And so you can see here, this is the average of 7 days in 2012-13, and now if we look just at weekends, you can see how much lower the concentrations are, the columns are everywhere. So that's an important feature. In my world, there are almost no control experiments, but this is the one control experiment. Nitrogen oxide concentrations go down by half on the weekend. And so I'll put that now on the same sort of slide, same time series as we looked at the organic chemicals. So the organic chemicals went down by about a factor of 6. At the beginning of this record on weekdays, the nitrogen oxides in Los Angeles were up around 65, and today they're down around 20. And also you might say that there's a little bit of this leveling off towards the end of this record because the effectiveness of the controls on cars is reaching its limit. Okay, so that's the ingredients in making ozone and particles. Let me say a little bit about the chemistry. The chemistry of making ozone is tricky, and it's tricky because if you have a lot of nitrogen oxides, as you decrease them, you make ozone faster, up to some point after which you make ozone slower again. And this works both if you think in a particular location, but it also works if you think about dilution as the city center chemicals get spread out into the surroundings. So as you spread out into the surroundings, the concentration of nitrogen oxides decreases, and you might make the chemistry faster, or if you cross this peak, then you'll make the chemistry slower. So we test this by looking at the weekend effect. On the weekend, the amount of organic chemicals stays roughly constant. That's any one of these individual blue lines. And the nitrogen oxides change by about a factor of 2. So if we're out over here on the weekend, we expect ozone to be worse. If we were over here on a weekend, the open circles, we would expect ozone to be better. And then the other thing to fold into this is temperature. We tend to have more organic chemicals in the atmosphere when it's hot. So on a cool day, we might be over here and we'd be making ozone slowly, and on a hot day, we're up here and we're making it fast. And you can see that this place where the transition moves to higher nitrogen oxides as it gets hotter. So there's the interplay of all those different things in this chemistry. Let me give you one way of looking at it. Here's a record over time, and we ask the question, what are the odds on any given day of ozone being above 100 ppb? That's well above the health-based threshold, but it's a useful threshold for showing progress. So at the beginning of this record in the early 90s, the odds of, in San Bernardino, downwind of you, of having ozone above 100 ppb was basically 1. Every single day when it was hot, you had really high ozone in San Bernardino. If it was cooler, it was only 60% of the time. Today, we've marched through this. Here we are in, if we take North Main Street, on a hot day, we're now down to where only 10% of the time we have really high ozone. And on a cool day, at the beginning of this record at North Main Street, half the time you had high ozone, and now never. But 100 ppb is not the health-based threshold. So let's look at 70 as the target, and you can see at 70, we're still in San Bernardino, downwind of you. Every single day is in violation of the standard if it's hot. And we've only gotten to about 75% in LA proper on a hot day. But on a cool day, we've gone from almost every single day in the mid-90s to being in violation of the standard 90% of the days, to now where we're down around 40%. But you can see the direction. On a weekday, it's 30% of the weekdays are above 70, and weekends it's 45 or 50. So we're still in this chemical regime where reducing nitrogen oxides makes things worse. So just to go back to this drawing, we're still somewhere on this side of the curve, and if we wanted nitrogen oxides to be the only policy we would affect, we need to get across this peak. And we're not there yet. We're close. We're close to this ridge, but we're not there. But you can see sort of downwind of you, we're kind of flat. Maybe this line was steeper. So there's some benefits, but we still have work to do there. So that's the story on ozone. And then I just want to say a little bit about PM 2.5. Here, just Riverside, because I had better data in a slide form to show you. The story in Los Angeles proper is similar. 20 years ago, the number of times you exceeded the standard for 20 years ago of 15 micrograms per cubic meter PM 2.5 at 20C was about 80–85%. And if we got to really hot days above 30, it was almost every day. And then in 2017, the standard was reduced to 12 micrograms in the intervening time. But now you can see the really steep temperature dependence. When it's cold, we're in the summertime, we pretty much never violate the health-based standard. And when it's hot, it's still 80% of the days. And this is interesting because we've been quite effective at some controls. So this is ammonium nitrate, the two ingredients I'm showing you here, the ammonium in aerosol and the nitrate. And you can see just the colors, the darker color is more recent. Ammonium nitrate is interesting because it evaporates if it gets really hot. So it peaks at these middle temperatures, right around 30. And then as it gets hotter, the ammonium nitrate is a solid, but that solid evaporates and becomes a gas again. Okay, so just a little more of this history then. So if we look at the total amount of PM 2.5 versus temperature, in the decade from 1999 to 2009. That's here in red. And I put a black line as the health-based standard of the time. You can see pretty much independent of temperature, you were always above that line. So temperature wasn't the driving feature in thinking about aerosol 20 years ago. If we do that today, you can see here's the health-based standard. At low temperatures, you're almost always below that standard. And the hotter it gets, the more often you're above that standard. And the reason for that is we've reduced the ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate, the so-called inorganic chemicals that contribute to aerosol, and organic chemicals are now the dominant story. And if we measure the chemistry of the aerosol and pick out just that organic part, you can see it has a really clean temperature dependence. There's less than there was 15, 20 years ago, but the temperature dependence is even sharper and more clean. And more, this is the key factor that's driving high aerosol in Los Angeles and the Los Angeles basin. And here's where I have to say there's some debate in my community. I can't tell you the answer for this yet. You know, personally, I think it has to do with emissions from trees. But I have other colleagues who will tell you it's these volatile chemical products, the personal care products, and associated industrial chemicals. Okay. So I think I got asked to speak to you because I made some comments in the newspaper about the other control experiment we've done in the atmosphere, which is to turn off all the cars for about 6 weeks at the beginning of the shelter in place. In March and April 2020. And those shelter-in-place orders resulted in really substantial reductions of cars and trucks on the road. And they also resulted in much lower use of downtown buildings, and that should say much, not muck, much lower restaurant activity. And as a consequence, emissions of CO2, nitrous oxides, and VOC from vehicles dropped dramatically, and roughly in proportion to the number of vehicles on the road. There were other things that happened. So restaurants that were downtown were also almost entirely shuttered. So to the extent that the aerosol that we breathe is primary aerosol from cooking, and that's an important term that's not temperature dependent. The primary particles from cooking dropped, or they relocated to our homes. It's not yet clear which of those is the right way to think about it. In California, we have an incredible data set. I haven't downloaded the Los Angeles data set, so I'll show you the San Francisco data set. I've seen other people show the LA data, so it looks similar. So this is the miles traveled by vehicles on the region's cars. And red is before the shelter-in-place order, and black is after that shelter-in-place order. And you can see that on the weekends, cars on top, trucks on bottom. On the weekends, the trucks drop dramatically. They drive many fewer miles. And that was even more true after the shelter-in-place. And you can see, slight day-to-day differences in the vehicle miles traveled, but there was a big drop. It started a couple of days before the shelter-in-place order as people started to realize that congregating was a bad plan, and then the order came, and there was a very large and persistent drop, and then people started to go back to work a little bit. We've done a bunch of work to quantify the change in CO2 emissions. So I'll show you that here just for reference. In the San Francisco Bay Area, the CO2 goes into the atmosphere from cars and trucks. That's the orange. And from industrial facilities and our homes, that's the purple. And before the shelter in place, on almost every day of the week, it was above about 400 in these units, tons of carbon per hour, with big peaks in morning rush hour. And a little bit less on weekends, maybe barely just kissing that 400 tons of carbon per hour. And after the shelter in place, it was always below that threshold. And this is an analysis where we took the measured CO2 in the atmosphere and combined it with a weather model to work backwards to how much CO2 was emitted. We then check that against the change in the cars, and the answer we get is very similar. And the other thing that happened and confounds a lot of the analysis of thinking about the COVID period is spring came. So in the world of CO2, that meant the trees were all greening, and trees take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they're very aggressive at that. So the change between before the shelter in place, when there were hardly any green on the Bay Area's trees, and after, where it starts to jump out at you and be a number that's large compared to the total, was important to get right. So the same thing happened in LA. The emissions of NOx and VOC from cars were reduced, and also some of the NOx from trucks were reduced. The confounding issue is April 2020 was unusually warm. So there was a lot of consternation all over the world that we took all these cars off the road, we stopped going to work, and in many places, ozone air pollution got worse. In some places, particle air pollution got worse. And the answer is that the weather is a really important factor. And so you can't just compare April to April or the 6 weeks before the shelter in place to the 6 weeks after. You have to compare days of the same weather, because the weather is an enormous factor in how much air pollution we have. But the result for air pollution in LA was during that shelter in place period, ozone was high, and it was similar to high ozone on weekends because the NOx was reduced about the same amount as the weekend NOx. And it was hot, so that added to it. But this is sort of exactly what we expect. So it confirms our understanding of the chemistry, but it wasn't the nice story that we stopped going to work and we're immediately clean. The aerosol story is much harder. The high temperatures, but also the change in restaurants, that combination is confounding and difficult to disentangle so far. I want to highlight that the imperfect understanding that we have is been a major driver in experiments that happened this summer, some that I was involved in that were funded by South Coast Air District and the State Air Resources Board. Colleagues of mine did an experiment funded by NOAA, and it was really to understand this combination of factors that I just told you about, the intersection of temperature or volatile chemical products, trees, et cetera, in the Los Angeles air pollution. The NOAA group is planning to come back in 2 years, maybe 3, depending on how far out their research projects get pushed by COVID, shutting a lot of their work down. And I'll say that, in addition, there's all kinds of great new technologies that I and my colleagues are bringing to the table, and those are especially good for mapping the air pollution and making connections to environmental justice. So building the kind of maps that Dr. Sanko showed of where the most heart attacks are, we'd like to build those same kind of maps by census district of where the most air pollution is, and for exactly the same reasons. So I can say a couple recommendations for where your commission might weigh in. I think electrification is a tool that we have today that we didn't have before, and really pushing heavily to make that happen quicker, especially for trucks that might be in distribution centers but on the highways as well. The ability in the short-haul trucking industry, those trucks that go from the port to a distribution center, to electrify will happen first. But there's, to my surprise, when I learned what was happening in that industry, there's 12 or 15 manufacturers who are all competing to deliver heavy-duty electric trucks. So there's tremendous potential for that, and trucking is connected to some of the worst air pollution and the worst health effects from air pollution. So to the extent that your commission could use its influence to accelerate those developments, I think it would be good for the health of the people of Los Angeles. The other thing is that trees are a mixed bag, and we need to elevate thinking about trees so we plant the right trees. Trees moderate urban heat, so they're an important piece of our health-based plans to reduce heat stroke, reduce the urban heat island effects. They have other social benefits that are important, but we need to be careful to plant trees that are low in their organic chemical emissions. And there are choices. Monterey pines, it turns out, are better than certain kinds of palm trees for whatever reason. I'm not a biologist, and I make no claim to understand. What I do understand is that some trees are better than others. And then I'm not ready to recommend to you that we do something about volatile chemical products, but as we understand these, we may need to come to some terms with finding ways to use less of those chemical products. So I want to close here. I know there's a plan for 1 million trees in Los Angeles. I think that plan can have tremendous benefits, but I raise a note of caution that it can contribute to poor air quality if we don't plant the right trees. And so I want to just thank you for listening. It's been a long meeting, and I know that you all must be tired, but I'm also happy to take your questions, and appreciate your staying to the end.
Thank you. That was wonderful and very enlightening, and I really appreciate the kind of research you do, and also for educating us. If you could maintain contact with our research associates, because we'd love to know if you could get data on which trees, maybe the top 10 trees that would be the best for air quality, but also that would potentially live in this kind of environment here, as opposed to, say, in Berkeley or Northern California. That would be beneficial for us to know. We previously, about 2 years ago, had a discussion on the fact that there's so much homelessness in Los Angeles, and that, where can we build new housing? And unfortunately, a lot of the places to build high-rise new housing that would be, a great place to build from an economic point of view happens to be, within 100 yards of the numerous freeways that we have in LA City. Is there a way, or is there good filtering that can be placed into residential areas or in commercial areas so that we could filter out both the particulate matter as well as some of the other chemicals that you just lectured about?
So I think if you're thinking about building systems to protect occupants indoors, then all the kinds of things that you might have talked about to protect people indoors from COVID are the same things. So the particles that contribute to poor health and asthma and cardiac problems, both chronic and acute, those particles are about the same size as the particles that are in the air contributing to COVID. So building filtration systems will work. I think, we have this sort of timeline question. We know that 20 years from now, everything is electric. So the question is sort of, what do we do in the interim to make it safe to build that housing near the highway? And I would refer that question to you. I think it's the core question for you to think about is sort of, in what ways is it okay to build housing near the highway in the 15 years during this transition to an all-electric vehicle fleet? But at the end, after that fleet is electric, I think it's mostly fine.
And then the second question, also following up on the same thing, is that there's been some discussion about maybe covering some of our freeways to get more parkland available, because we're also one of the most underparked cities in America. And yet if you covered freeways, you'd have these long kind of tunnels that would exist. And with traffic maybe being relatively slow, is there a way to properly filter and or protect individuals who are stuck in those cars in a tunnel that might be 3 miles long or 2 miles long?
I am insufficiently expert on the filtering in cars. My sense is the filtering in cars itself is not good enough, and that you couldn't have a MERV 13 filter in your car and it'd be effective. But to be honest, I don't know. And in the tunnel itself, I think the airflow handling in the tunnel itself would be a prohibitive cost. So I think there again, I think there we're safe. By the time you build a tunnel, the vehicles are going to be all electric. And so I think that those timelines will sync up. And I don't know that we should be worrying about it.
Are you aware of any filters that like for, say, the Lincoln Tunnel between New York and New Jersey? Are there good enough filters in those kinds of, or are there more modern filters that could be built at the time of covering?
So I'm just going to speak as a driver through tunnels. I've never driven through a tunnel that doesn't have black rime on the sides. And so I know of no experience where I've had, that tunnel or any other tunnel. And so that's the extent of my ignorance.
Okay, great. If you hear of some scientist who actually knows that, you can send them our way. We'd love to have more information on it. We're honored that you come to present to us. I'll open the floor for questions. Councillor Vaughn, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great, phenomenal presentation. I'm also actually curious with respect to even climate change. I think California now, for 5 of the last 6 years, keeps having every year more historic and larger fires. Like, we keep having the largest fire every year in the state. How is that affecting air quality with respect to Los Angeles or even San Francisco, with these fires that keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year? If you have that data, or
Yeah, so that data is widely available, and I have that. I've looked at it. I think so, and I know some work has been done on the public health consequences of those fires. So my colleague Rachel Morello-Frosch has shown that there's for women who became pregnant, in the vicinity of those fires, I think 2 weeks before or something. I forget the details, but she showed that their babies were lower birth weight 9 months later for people who were exposed to big fires. So there are real consequences to that. It's extremely well measured because, unlike a lot of other atmospheric signals, those are really big. You see it with your eye. And our colleagues in the forestry community are really working on that issue, and they divide it in 2 ways that I think are important for us to think about. One is the urban wildland interface. So there's the question about what happens to people who live next to the fire, whose homes are in danger, or who are directly exposed to really near the fire. Or the question I was talking to a colleague about the other day was, what are the chemicals that are emitted by a burning city as opposed to a burning forest fire? And do those matter for the health of people? So those are all good questions, and we sort of know generically that, all of those things are bad, but quantitatively how bad, some of that is an epidemiology question. It's, atmospheric scientists have really good measurements of what happens, but coupling that to the right health data is really where the answers will be. And so that's beyond the scope. And then the worse every year, I don't see a short-term solution to that, because it is the intersection with it. Even if we stop climate change tomorrow and we're just steady where we are, our forests are a mess, and they're a mess from 100 years of a management strategy that we now know was flawed, and because it's hotter and drier.
Thank you, sir.
Wonderful. Commissioner Hisserick, did you have a question, or he dropped off? Okay.
I think his hand was up from the beginning.
I thought so too, but I wanted to give him the opportunity. I think you're right. Your presentation was wonderful. We're honored that you would come and present to us. One of the blessings that we've had on this commission, thanks to the COVID virus, that we've been able to bring from all around the world leading experts like yourself, which we previously couldn't really do because our budget wouldn't allow you to fly down to present to us in City Hall. And so one small good thing about this pandemic is that we've had the pleasure to listen to people like yourself. And we thank you for doing your research, for educating us, and for making yourself available to us. The people of Los Angeles, thank you very much.
Let me say thank you to you, and with more warning, I'd be happy to find an excuse to travel to LA on someone else's dime and see you in person.
I wish we had the dime to give you to do that.
It doesn't have to be yours. I could find an excuse to go visit a colleague at USC or Caltech, and
oh, good. All right. Well,
just couple it to a visit to you, but we'd have to do some planning.
Yeah, we can work on that. And one of the things we're going to work on is trying to get the city of Los Angeles to give us a budget so that we could actually finance research projects as well as bring people to us. So that's part of our long-term agenda to improve the health of the city of Los Angeles. But I wouldn't hold your breath as long as we're talking about air in ozone. I would say don't hold your breath on that one yet. But we'll keep on working on it.
But nudge your friends at the South Coast District, because if you had something you wanted to collaborate on with them on, I think they might find the money.
Thank you. I appreciate that advice.
Right.
Take
you so
care,
much.
and with a big assumption here, Shana Tova, and if you fast, may you have an easy and simple fast.
Thank you so much. You too.
Moving on to the next agenda item, we're pleased to have both Sarah and Lauren present us initial information about the 2021 annual report that we're working on. Sarah, I think you're up.
Perfect. Well, first I want to thank all the speakers for coming. The presentations were wonderful and very informing, so thank you. So I'm going to keep this short because I know it is quite late, but if you don't already know me, my name is Sarah Koshmiati. I am one of the research associates for the Commission, and I will be presenting briefly on the Commission report. The other research associates, Lauren, Marvin, and our wonderful intern Claire and I have spent the last couple of months consolidating information from city and statewide departments and officials, reviewing presentations from field professionals that have presented during the last year at our Commission meetings, and building recommendations we believe best represent the interests and needs of Los Angeles citizens, the Health Commission, and City Council. This year's report covers 4 sections, including homelessness, healthy living, medical services, and COVID-19 surveillance and control. Section on homelessness was drawn upon expert interviews, research, data analysis, and presentations given to the Commission. We presented policy solutions that City Council can implement to help reduce homelessness and improve the health and well-being of the city's homeless population. This section will be covering topics such as housing first and permanent supportive housing units, emergency shelters and transition housing, encampment sweeps and hygiene, sobering centers, discharge planning, and food insecurity and assistance. Commissioner Shannon cannot be with us today, but she's already expressed a few changes she would like to implement regarding expanding the section on housing first, adoption of non-congregate centers instead of congregate emergency shelters, which have led to various outbreaks amongst communities experiencing homelessness, as mentioned by Commissioner Shannon. We'll be making these changes before the next meeting in October. The section on healthy living covers the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Los Angeles' education system, while considering the social and environmental impact it has produced. The section covers COVID-19 transmission among students, informed by Dr. Alice Kuo's presentation on the spread of COVID-19 in schools at the beginning of the pandemic. We've also adopted the current CDC guidelines for schools, school administrators, staff, and students on how to best stop the spread of the virus. Section also covers the effects of school time reduction on student learning loss and identifies risks that may make school-age children more susceptible to developing greater learning losses. Other topics include when and how schools will reopen, access to digital learning devices to discuss the digital divide amongst different socioeconomic and racial groups. And we also discussed the 4-day work week, which was informed by Dr. Andrew Barnes' presentation, and the potential impacts it can produce in the economy and in the environment, which leads us to the last section, air pollution during COVID-19, which was informed by Dr. Cohen's presentation today. The third section, medical services, focuses on the prevention, surveillance, and control of major diseases, as well as EMS services that are available in LA. This section covers emergency medical service calls, increased use of fast response vehicles, expansion of response programs such as advanced provider response units, expansion of county hospitals and funding, the Affordable Care Act's implementation, and identifying ways to strengthen the use of insurance and medical care by city residents, communicable disease response, and topics covering meningitis, typhus, and hepatitis outreach and education, and lastly, a section covering STDs and HIVs in LA County and our supported implementation of the Ending the HIV Epidemic Plan for LA County. Our last section, COVID-19 surveillance and control, is not yet finished, but draft of the COVID-19 section will be completed in late September and distributed to all the commissioners. We plan to cover COVID-19 data reporting, coordination and planning, essential health services, infection prevention and control, and COVID-19 responses. We ask you all, commissioners, to review the commission report and email us any changes you would like to make, which will lead up to a revision process in which we'll conduct a section-by-section editing round at the October commission meeting. Commissioner Shannon also was interested in spearheading a small work group of commissioners that could provide revisions specifically to the section covering homelessness. I wanted to inquire about whether or not commissioners would like to work in small groups to address certain changes in various sections of the report and to abide by the Brown Act and make sure we're not in violation of the Brown Act. So that is all. You've all been emailed a copy of the report if you'd like to review it, and email me or Lauren, Marvin, or Claire any suggestions or revisions you all would like to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And for our speakers, this report is a serious document that is approximately 100 pages long, or will be approximately 100 pages long, and is well researched with scientific references behind, as well as testimony here. So thanks to experts like yourself, we're able to bring information that will help the people of Los Angeles. For yourselves, as well as to anybody in the general public who's listening to this presentation, commission meeting tonight, I want to publicly thank Sarah Kosciati, Lauren Yen, Marvin Chowdhury, and Claire Williams, who are our voluntary research associates. They're not getting paid for this. The senior research associates literally spend probably 20 hours a week working on this to improve the health of the people in the city of Los Angeles, and we could not function without them, and we are extremely thankful. And on behalf of the commission and the people of Los Angeles, I want to publicly thank you all for all your work. And for the other commissioners, please reach out to them, and when you read through the first draft that has been sent to you, and mark it up and involve them so that we could have your voices heard, so that we can have an open debate on this in October, November, so we can have the report done by Thanksgiving. Any commissioners have something to state or ask of the research associates? If you want to work in small groups, just refresher, Brown Act, limits the number that can get involved. You have to be very, very cautious. Emails can only be to less than 50% of individuals. If you want to send something out to the entire commission, please go through the city clerk's office, or you can go through the research associates who then can facilitate that for you. And this way we will not violate the state act. Any other? Seeing no hands, seeing no other input, I'll look forward to seeing everybody in the October meeting. So I'm always available for anybody if you want to reach out to me. Thank you once again to both of the speakers who are still here. We're honored by your presence and honored by your intelligence and dedication to educate us. We truly appreciate the commission could not function without experts like yourself. And I would ask for a motion for adjournment.
Chair Mandel?
Yes.
Just wanted to remind you the meeting that October meeting is scheduled for Monday the 11th, which is a city holiday. It's actually, I think, federal holiday. And so we should decide if we want to meet the following Monday on the 18th or another day that week.
I would say the 18th because people kind of scheduled the Mondays, but I would leave that open to the commission further for any discussion. Is that amenable to the commissioners? I'm seeing some heads go yes.
Yes, 18 for me.
18 course.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine.
I don't think we need a vote on it. I haven't seen anybody saying no. So having said that, we'll schedule it for the 18th. I want to also publicly thank the city clerk's office who have always supported us and helped us. I don't think Erica is on today, but I appreciate Erica's dedication to help us, and including when we have scheduling issues. And Rita, you're always amazing, and we love having you back to support us and work with us. We're thrilled that the powers that be in the mayor's office and the city clerk's office have graced us with having you back with us. We truly appreciate that as well.
Well, we have some new staff, so things may move around a little bit, but I think I'll be keeping the commission. Unfortunately, they're not going to take any of my other workload, but it's fine. I'm glad to be back.
Great, wonderful. All right, so seeing, is there a motion for adjournment?
I'd like to make a motion.
I think
who was that?
Cato has made the motion, and was it Dr. Limos? Was that the second?
Irma.
Oh, Irma. Thank you, Commissioner Avila. All in favor of adjournment?
Aye.
I say aye. Aye. Any abstains or say no? Seeing none, we're adjourned.